auf die nächsten beiden Gäste, die jetzt hier auf der Bühne sind, Jessica King und Tim King, bin ich auch sehr stolz und freue mich sehr, dass Sie hier sind. Vor allen Dingen auch deswegen, weil Sie halt auch vor 2 Jahren nicht auf den Amiga30 Partys gewesen sind. Die beiden waren in die Amiga-DOS-Entwicklung involviert und werden gleich ein bisschen was darüber erzählen, inwiefern Sie dort dabei waren im Team, was Ihre Aufgaben waren, was Sie dort gemacht haben. Und auch hier gilt dann wieder, sollten Fragen sein, gerne Fragen stellen aus dem Publikum. Herzliches Dank an die beiden auf jeden Fall schon mal, dass Sie vorbeigekommen sind. Thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here in Neuss. Especially because you weren't around at the Amiga30 parties around the world, so it's some kind of special to have you here as guests. And we are really interested in hearing a little bit about your story and involvement to Commodore Amiga. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me? Good. I started off as I still am, a computer scientist. And I was an academic. I worked at the University of Cambridge, where I did my PhD. And whilst I was doing my PhD, I worked with some friends of mine who created an operating system called Tripos. And this was written entirely in a language called BCPL, and it was intended to be very portable. So it was a new idea at the time. It got my friend Brian Knight his PhD. And later on, I moved to the University of Bath. And at that point, a very important chip came out called the 68000. And this was a really important chip because for the first time, you could get away from the limit of 32 or 64K. Because Tripos worked well, but it was greedy with memory, and it needed more than 32K. So it didn't work on a PDP-11 or a Z80 or lots of other chips of that time. But as soon as the 68000 came out, it was a perfect place to move Tripos and to make it a system that worked well. So while I was at the University of Bath, I moved Tripos to the 68000 computer. And there were a number of computers about that I moved it to. One was called a Sage 4, made in California. And another was a computer made by some colleagues of mine at the University Engineering Department. I left academic life in 1983 when I discovered how much my students were earning. And I joined a small company called MetaComCo, taking with me Tripos for the 68000. And so then we went round looking for companies who needed an operating system for a 68000 based computer. And we didn't talk to Apple because they had one. We did talk to Atari, but they had one, although it wasn't very good. We talked to all sorts of different companies until we met Amiga. And it turned out that Amiga didn't have an operating system. They had exec, and they had some device drivers, and they had some very nice demonstrations, but they didn't have an operating system. So I managed to persuade Bob Pariseau, who was the head of technology at Amiga, to pay us £30,000 to move Tripos onto the Amiga. And this was really seen as an insurance policy because they already had given a specification to another company, but the other company had never come up with anything. So back in about 84, they gave me Amiga number 2. Now this was in a big black box, and it had all been made by hand, so it was incredibly valuable. And they insisted that, first of all, they sprayed it in foam, so it became an even bigger thing like this, covered in pink foam. and then I had to buy an airline seat for it. So on the ticket, it read Mr. Amiga on the airline seat. And I then got it back home and took it to our house, and I started working on trying to move Tripos from the Sage 4 to my new Amiga. I wasn't very much fun at the time.
No, I was working for MetaComCo as well. I'd be going off to work in the morning, and Tim was there working away in the upstairs bedroom. And I'd come back late in the evening, and he was upstairs working in the bedroom. And I'd go to bed, and he was upstairs working in the bedroom. And it went on like this for 3 whole weeks.
But after 3 weeks, I'd got really quite far. Although I did have one big problem. I couldn't get anything on the screen. And I had long conversations with the guy who'd written the device driver for the screen. And he said, "Are you doing this?" And I said, "Yes." "And are you doing this?" "Yes." And finally he said, "What color are you using?" And I said, "I can't afford a color screen. I've only got a monochrome screen." And he goes, "Ooh, maybe the default color can't be seen on a monochrome screen." So it had been working all along. It's just that it was in various hues that you couldn't see on a monochrome screen. He said, "Try and make it red." I went, "Oh, look, it works." And that was nearly a whole week wasted, I'm afraid. Not totally wasted. Anyway, I then got a flight back to California with my floppy disk containing Tripos. And I had arranged to see Bob Pariseau, and he kept me waiting all morning, sitting in the foyer. And in retrospect, he thought I was coming to ask some questions before I got started. So anyway, eventually he came over about midday with 2 of the engineers, Carl Sassenrath and Neil Catin, who'd done most of the work on doing the device drivers, saying, "These guys haven't got very much time, but they'll answer your questions as we go along." So I said, "Well, first of all, I'd just like to show you how far I've got." So I put the disk in, and it booted up, and I showed various things I could do, like edit a file and compile a program. And it ended up with 3 windows from Intuition, one running a compiler, one showing a disk listing, and one running the editor. And I sort of half-heartedly finished and said, "Well, that's about as far as I've got." And I turned round, and behind me was the whole company. They, rather than the 2 people who I'd been giving the demonstration to, they'd all been doing this and saying, "Come and see this." And the whole company, the secretaries, everybody, were all in a huge hoop around me, and they all burst into applause because they'd never seen their computer be a real computer before that. And it was at that time that I thought I'd probably got the job. So they then asked me well, they said, first of all, let's go and think about it, and they thought about it for about an afternoon, and then they said, "You've got the job. Will you stay here? What terms do you want?" And I said, "Well, there are 2 terms. One of which is I want my wife with me because she does the documentation. And secondly, I said, I want it written into the contract that I fly business class."
You didn't get it for me, though.
What?
Business class.
No, that's very true. She didn't get business class. I got business class. And then I phoned Jessica.
Yeah, well, whilst he was away, I thought, okay, got a weekend, before he comes back again, I'll pack up the cat in the basket, go and see my folks who lived 100 miles away in their farm, and, have a nice weekend with them. I'd hardly arrived, and I got this phone call on the landline saying, "You've got to come now." I said, "I've only just arrived." He said, "No, you've got to come now. You've got to bring absolutely everything." He gave me a long list of things I needed. And this was a Saturday, And in those days, you couldn't just go on your mobile and bring up internet and get tickets. And I thought, how am I going to do this? But somehow we managed. I called my friend who worked for Pan Am, and she organized the ticket. I packed up the cat again, went back down to MetaComCo, and we opened up the office. I then turned on every single computer I could find, and multitasking, I managed to get every single piece that he had on his long list on a pile of floppy disks. The cat, meanwhile, had got out, and I had to search 5 floors of the office. Nobody was there, it was a Sunday, and eventually found him in the executive washroom. But we got back, and somehow I managed to get the flight. But before I did that, Tim said, now when you go, don't forget that if you go on the underground train, you must never put anything like a floppy disk pack on the ground because it will destroy it. So I thought, okay, I won't do that. Got to London, got on the tube, put the bag down, I picked it straight up and thought, oh my God, it's ruined the entire Amiga project. But I carried on. We got to SFO, got to see Tim, and I admitted that I had put the floppy disks on the floor, on the tube, and he said, oh dear. And then...
Well, it worked. You were lucky. So just really a few memories of our times there. It was a very good time. We spent probably about 2 years on and off going back to California. I used to fly once a week. I would spend 1 week in the UK and 1 week in San Francisco, so they all called me Dr. Jet Lag. At one point, well, when we first started, we had to share a hotel suite with 3 Sun workstations because there wasn't any room in the offices. So we had a hotel suite for Jessica and myself and another colleague from MetaComCo who came over, and then 3 Sun workstations. And people would come in and work in our hotel suite every day.
I also had to use these workstations, but I had to wait before it was my turn to do it. And as you can imagine, there were all these people in this room. The only place I could go to get any peace whatsoever was the bathroom. So one day, it was a very smart room they put us in. I thought, well, I'll go and have a nice long bath. So I put all this lovely, gooey stuff in the bath. It all smelled lovely. And then I thought, ooh, what's that button do? That was a bad mistake. I pressed it. It was a jacuzzi, and the bubbles came up. And the bubbles kept on coming up. And I thought, oh dear, what am I going to do? There are all those people outside using the Sun terminals. What am I going to do? The bubbles kept on coming up, and then the bubbles went underneath the door, and then across the carpet, getting closer and closer to the Sun workstations. I had to quickly put on a towel and explain what had happened. It was one of the most embarrassing moments of my life, and now I'm sharing it with you.
The other memory is there was a celebration at Amiga because they'd brought back the first chips from Japan, and they worked. And so Rick Geiger, who was the guy in charge, had brought a vat of sake. And sake doesn't come in vats, it comes in big square boxes, and you drink it out of little square boxes. And I remember very clearly Rick opening this vat of sake with an axe, which is the traditional way of doing it. And I don't remember much else of the rest of the evening because the sake was also very strong.
They did good parties in those days, didn't they?
Another thing we remember, for example, is trying to find restaurants in Los Gatos that still did food at 11:30 at night. We ended up nearly always living off potato skins because it was the only thing that the barmaid could rustle up behind her bar. because we've just worked so long hours in order to get the thing ready.
What are you going to say now? Oh gosh, yes. Tim's just reminded me that when we were doing this work, just like now, there's some terrible fires in California. Well, there were then. And we were up in Los Gatos working, and we could see this sort of glow in the distance. It must have been about, 20 kilometers away, something like that. It was quite close. And we were wondering, do we get out? Do we stay? But luckily, I think the weather changed and all was well. But they found a lot of people who'd been living in the woods that they hadn't known about before, growing various things, no doubt. But anyway, that's another story.
I will also remember, of course, going to the Lincoln Center for the official launch. Jessica was sitting here, and Andy Warhol was sitting there. It was a very posh affair with black tie, so on and so forth. And there was a very good after party in a posh restaurant called the Inn on the Park that's in the middle of Central Park. And I got to chat to Debbie Harry, so that was good. The last thing we really did with Amiga was we started working with Braunschweig, with Hans here, and his director of engineering, a chap called Dieter Price. And the most overwhelming memory I have is of Dieter picking me up from the airport in Hanover and driving me to Braunschweig in a Golf GTI faster than I've ever been driven in my life before.
So thank you very much for all of you, and for the organisers and the people who've sponsored this occasion. So we've had a wonderful time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.